Hello, everyone. My name is Andre Puca, and I'm a professor at Emerson College, and I'm really happy to be sharing with you Federico Fellini's 8½" through a seminar being delivered by the Coolidge Corner Cinema. Like I mentioned in the intro, this is one of my favorite films. In fact, I think you can see back there, that's a poster of the film 8½", which is hanging on my bedroom wall. So if that doesn't prove, I'm a huge fan. Hopefully this PowerPoint / discussion will. I think Fellini's 8½" is his most personal and his best film. But I'm not the only one who thinks so. Fellini himself does. So in 1986, he was being interviewed by Bert Cardullo and was asked, "Do any of your films represent you more completely than the others? Is any one of them more key than the others? A film to preserve, as they say." Fellini says, "Two of them, La Strada and 8½". And here's what he says about the importance of 8½" to him. 8½" is meant to be an attempt to reach an agreement with life, an attempt and not a result or conclusion. I think the film may suggest a solution to make friends with yourself completely, without hesitation, without false modesty, without fears, but also without hopes. So I think that's a beautiful little summary of what you have in store for you when you watch or rewatch 8½". And that's definitely something I was struck by when I took a seminar class in college on the film. We studied 3 different films, actually. It was a seminar class on Carl Jung and art cinema, and we watched and studied 3 films. Ingmar Bergman's Persona, Fellini's 8½", and Nicholas Roeg's Walkabout. And so we watched each film probably 5 or 8 times each over the course of the semester, and spent over a month, analyzing each film, reading about it, and having seminar-style discussions at least weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, about the film. So I was struck at first by, in fact, how personal it was, and how maybe Fellini was the first filmmaker I encountered who talked about his cinema less from an intellectual point of view and much more from this personal point of view, from the point of view of someone who was using the art form to essentially catalog a lifetime of change and development. And 8½" is definitely one of those movies. It's a chronicle of Fellini's transition into midlife, at the very least. So to dive into the film, I want to start with a little potted biography that I think, while it's short, helps describe how Fellini becomes a filmmaker, because it's not like he went to school to study film. That wasn't his primary interest as a child, although he loved movies. And so I think it'll be useful. I also want to invite you periodically to pause the video to check out the quotes that I won't have time to read. There are a lot of them throughout this PowerPoint, and there were so many good ones to choose from, right? This one, right on the title page here, is just another description of Fellini's mission when he created 8½". And again, it's a really nice summary of what he's trying to achieve, and a good framing device for watching the film, again, either for the first time or maybe second or third. This will be my 20th or 30th time watching it. So a couple of important pieces of background that I think will help you appreciate 8½" more. Fellini was born in a sleepy little seaside town on the west coast of northern Italy called Rimini, and he made a movie about sort of growing up in this, not growing up, but being a young man in this town called I Vitelloni, which I highly recommend. His first love was drawings, specifically drawing cartoons and caricatures. In 1937, at the age of 17, Fellini contributes his first drawing to a publication that was run by a fascist youth organization that was a lot like the Boy Scouts, essentially. It was called Opera Balilla. That same year, he starts contributing to a weekly humor magazine called 420, or entitled 420, which was based out of Florence. And, excuse me, a year later, he starts contributing to another weekly publication, which, like 420, was a humor magazine called Domenica del Corriere. And so this is his start as a illustrator, as a cartoonist, because he loved American cartoons like Popeye and Mickey Mouse and The Phantom, things like this. In 38, he moves to Rome, and he starts, well, not right away, but eventually he'll start a shop, a business called the Funny Face Shop, where he's providing caricatures and cartoons to American soldiers stationed in Rome. Right before that, though, in 39, he gets his most important illustrating job at Marco Aurelio, which was Italy's largest, most popular weekly humor magazine, with a circulation of over 350,000 weekly. Here, Fellini will contribute over the next 3 years something like 700 illustrations, comic illustrations, cartoons, and comedic scenarios. You know, like he will write the dialogue and the storylines of these either, you know, serial cartoons or individual illustrations. And Marco Aurelio was a kind of training ground for a lot of future screenwriters. Many screenwriters sort of began their career writing for Marco Aurelio or illustrating, and then would make the connections necessary to transition into a film career. That's how Fellini ends up becoming first a screenwriter and then a director. So he starts contributing scripts for radio shows, like comedic sketches, over the next couple of years into the early 40s. And in 1944, after he makes friends with, or becomes very good friends with, maybe Italy's most popular actor at the time, most famous actor, Aldo Fabrizi. And if he's not the most famous actor at the time, he's second only to Totò, but he's up there in the 1 or 2 slot. Fabrizi was also known for his comedic roles. So he and Fellini hit it off. Fabrizi loved Fellini's drawings. Fellini loved Fabrizi's roles in all of his comic classics. So that's how Fellini meets Rossellini, Roberto Rossellini, who a year later would go on to release what many consider to be the first neo-realist classic, Rome Open City. Rossellini visits Fellini and asks him to contribute some comedic scenarios to the film. Fellini is honored to do so. That turns into a collaboration that will last 3 more films until Fellini gets a job working for Look Studios, which was one of Italy's largest production companies. And there he would be writing full-length screenplays, often collaborating with another screenwriter named Tullio Pinelli. This is really important because Pinelli and Fellini will work on numerous films together. Pinelli was one of Fellini's longest writing partners, along with another screenwriter named Ennio Flaiano. In fact, the two, Flaiano, Pinelli, and Fellini, all worked together along with another screenwriter named Brunello Rondi on 8½. So the Flaiano-Fellini collaboration through Lux was an incredibly important formative experience for Fellini. Fellini met one more very important collaborator at Lux, the composer Nino Rutta, who would go on to compose all of Fellini's most famous musical scores, including the score to 8½. So that was the beginning of another, beautiful friendship, as they say. So now that Fellini has written over a dozen films and collaborated with filmmakers like Rossellini and Pietro Germi and Alberto Latuada, these are, sort of big guns of the Italian film industry at the time. In the early 50s, he directs his first film. And here I'm going to fast forward for the sake of time to 8½, which is, it's definitely not, it doesn't mark the midpoint of his career, but it definitely marks the beginning of his midlife. I mean, he's in his early 40s when he finishes 8½. Okay, so let's get to the genesis of the story for 8½, which wasn't much of a story, more like a very loose idea. So Fellini had just finished La Dolce Vita, which was incredibly successful, not just financially, but critically. In fact, it was the first foreign language film to be nominated for Best Director by the Academy Awards. So the producer of that film, La Dolce Vita, Angelo Rizzoli, basically gave Fellini carte blanche to do whatever he wanted next. He had unlimited capital to make whatever movie he wanted next. In fact, Rizzoli, to sort of sweeten the deal, offered Fellini a 25% partnership in a production company that would be called Federi's, which is a combination of, Fellini's first name, Federico, and Rizzoli's last name. That partnership never came to fruition, but it's just an indication of how much confidence Rizzoli had in Fellini. Okay, so in late 1960, in October, Fellini writes to one of his newest collaborators, writing partners Brunello Rundi, about an idea for a movie about someone suffering from some kind of creative block. Well then, a guy, a writer, any kind of professional man, a theatrical producer, has to interrupt the usual rhythm of his life for 2 weeks because of a not too serious disease. It's a warning bell. Something is blocking up his system. That was the kernel of the idea that inspired 8½. But Fellini didn't have much else besides this rough idea. Didn't even know what profession the main character, what career the main character occupied or pursued or performed. So he starts scouting, hoping that, the film that he'll discover the film through scouting locations and that it would, sort of inspire and unblock his own writer's block that he was suffering from at the time. The hard thing, Fellini says, is beginning. Whatever it is you want to do in life, you must begin it. The point of departure for the journey I must begin for each film is generally something that really happened to me, but which I believe is also part of the experience of others, and that would be the sort of writer's block. He then pitches this very loose idea to Ennio Flaiano and Tullio Pinelli, along with Brunello Rundi, and Flaiano sort of jokingly, tentatively entitles the film La Bella Confusione, or The Beautiful Confusion, which Fellini changed after his producer Rizzoli, sort of suggested that it was not exactly a strong title. And so the title 8½, comes from the place in Fellini's canon that this movie occupies. It's because the first film that Fellini directed, he co-directed. And so he considers that, not a full creative or full directorial debut. So this would have been his eighth and a half film. So there's a ton of autobiography inspiring the film right from the beginning. This director's block continued to plague him for several years, to the point where Fellini signs a contract with Rizzoli to make the film. He schedules the production dates. He has the sets constructed. He casts all of the lead actors. He starts screen tests at the Scalera Studios in Rome. And he still has almost no idea what the story will be. He has these vignettes, or these vignettes which are crafted from memories or dreams, but they're not tied together in any coherent way. Here's Fellini commenting on this director's block. In the case of 8½, something happened to me which I feared could happen, but when it did, it was more terrible than I could ever have imagined. I suffered director's block, like writer's block. I had a producer, a contract. I was at Cinecittà, which was the largest film studio in Italy. It was also nationalized during the fascist, film era. And everybody was ready and waiting for me to make a film. What they didn't know was that the film I was going to make had fled from me. There were sets already up, but I couldn't find, so this should be my sentimental feeling. I was in a no exit, Fellini says this next bit, because the sets are constructed, the crew's there, either a grip is celebrating a birthday or the crew is celebrating sort of the beginning of the film's production. The accounts vary, but Fellini's writing a letter to Rizzoli saying, I gotta back out of this. I don't have a full script. I don't know what I'm doing. And this interruption occurs. Fellini's invited to toast with the crew, and then he has the idea. Instead of trying to figure out a story to connect these different fantasies and memories, he'll just tell the story of his own writer's block, of what it's like to make a movie when you don't know what the movie, how it will end, what it will be like. I mean, this is the exact opposite of what someone like a director like Alfred Hitchcock's approach to writing and producing a film. The exact opposite. So he was in this no exit situation. I was a director who wanted to make a film he no longer remembers. And lo and behold, at that very moment, everything fell into place. I got straight to the heart of the film. I would narrate everything that had been happening to me. I would make a film telling the story of a director who no longer knows what film he wanted to make. And when I read that for the first time, I was impressed that someone with such a solid reputation, you know, maybe one of the most important filmmakers in the world, is this candid about his own insecurity, and also this honest about how adventurous the process of making a film can be when you relent to what you don't know. This is something that Jung would talk about a lot, that the psychologist Carl Jung, who was a huge influence on Fellini and 8½, the act of not knowing is one of the most exhilarating experiences that humans can have. And that's what, you know, inspired Jung to chase after, or to study cultures and myths from around the world. It's what inspired Fellini really to make 8½. So now Fellini has his inspiration, and in May of 1962, shooting begins and lasts 4 months. This is a huge amount of time to spend on the production of a single film, just the shooting, I mean, because this doesn't include the editing and all of the post-production. Near the viewfinder of the camera, Fellini placed a little note that said, "Remember, this is a comic film," which I just think is hilarious. Fellini's American press officer noticed that he was constantly improvising, that often he would tell the actors and actresses to say whatever they wanted because he knew that he would be dubbing the dialogue in, the audio in after the fact, which was very standard for Italian movies at the time. That was common practice. Excuse me. This was part of both the improvisation and having actors mouth gibberish so that he could dub in whatever he wanted later. That was also a common practice for Fellini, at least at this point. The picture I make is never exactly the one I started out to make, but that's of no importance. I'm very flexible on the set. The script provides the starting point as well as offering security. After the first weeks, the picture takes on a life of its own. When Fellini finished 8½, he had an ending planned out that included Guido and his wife sort of making amends, while Fellini calls it a rapprochement. They're on a train to Rome in the dining car, and Guido looks out the window and he sees all of the characters of the film smiling at him, but it's kind of an ambiguous smile just as they enter a tunnel. That was supposed to be the original ending. When Fellini shot a trailer to the film, he said he got all the actors back on set, plus a bunch of extras, and filmed basically this scene out of something like a circus, which he liked so much better, and Flaiano liked so much better. And so that, what was to be the trailer of the film, became the ending, the now very famous ending of the film, which is sort of a vision or fantasy sprung from Guido's mind. That was basically a happy accident, which again, for a film with this kind of budget, with this kind of with the kinds of production values that it has, to know that Fellini is essentially happening upon an ending, which was not planned, which was not even necessarily prefigured by the rest of the movie, but something that spontaneously arose out of a new wellspring of inspiration and imaginative energy, is just, well, it's it's not only inspiring, it's something to admire, because there are all sorts of filmmakers, but the kinds we tend to line ours are the ones like Hitchcock, who have a really deliberate process from start to finish. And it's difficult to come across directors who are as improvisatory as Fellini, as whimsical, but also as masterful, and who show a careful eye toward visualization, dialogue, scoring, all of it. Okay, I'm gushing here, sorry. 8½" was almost instantly considered a masterpiece, and here's just like a quick survey of all of the award nominations and wins that it got, including its Academy Award nominations and wins. It's now considered one of the 100 most important films of all time. I mean, the British Film Institute, the American Film Institute, across the board, 8½" is considered a masterpiece. Again, one of the most important films ever made. Okay, so all of that out of the way, and I'm sorry for kind of doing this in a piecemeal staccato rhythm, but really all of that is way less important, I think, than the influence of Carl Jung on 8½. There are many ways to approach an analysis or reading of 8½, but by far the most fruitful, I think, is through an understanding of Fellini's relationship with the writings of Carl Jung, the psychologist, who was a contemporary, essentially, of Sigmund Freud. So early in the 60s, Fellini encountered the work of Jung through a psychotherapist friend named Dr. Ernst Bernhardt. Now, Fellini never underwent therapy, but Jungian psychoanalysis was the thing that inspired him, not necessarily the process of psychoanalysis, not the practical on-the-ground process, but the theoretical underpinnings of Jungian psychotherapy. The discovery of Jung helped me to bolder in my trust of fantasy over realism. That's really important because Fellini once said very famously that we all live in fantasy worlds. The difference between himself and everyone else is that he acknowledges that. Most people don't. Most people think that they're realistic, right? That their worldview is objective, or that it's, it is in line with everyone else's. Fellini says, that's bunk. We all live in little private fantasies, and I just acknowledge that, whereas most people don't. He also said he was a liar, but an honest one, if that helps you get a better sense of where he's coming from, especially in this movie, 8½. But that preference for fantasy or desire over realities is central to understanding 8½. When he started having these meetings with this Jungian psychotherapist, he was encouraged to create a dream journal. And what you see here are sketches over the course of his life, starting in his early 40s, from that dream journal. So this is something from his childhood. Here's Fellini in a classroom setting, but instead of indoors in a town square in Rimini. This is the young, slender Fellini juxtaposed with the older, fatter Fellini. This is an illustration of Fellini and the Pope, and essentially the character of the Saragina from 8½. And unfortunately, the print is too small for me to read out to you. But Jung was an inspiration not only to 8½, but to Fellini himself. It markedly changed the course of his life afterward. I'm not going to read all of these quotes about the influence of Jung because they probably take up too much time. So again, I ask you to pause the video, maybe take them in, reflect for a minute or two on, especially if you've seen 8½, on how this influence is visible, or how it might be visible in the film. Okay, it's just Fellini has been numerous times on the record describing this influence. So it's too important not to address, especially in this film. Now, Fellini acknowledges that almost everything in the film is inspired by something that happened to him. In particular, for example, the Saragina episode. So that episode will be very obvious to you if you haven't seen the film when you watch it. But the Saragina is essentially a prostitute character. And Fellini talks about, if you read this quote, how there was just such a prostitute in Rimini, and how he and his friends as children would sort of, as a pack run up to her little hovel or domicile and sort of tease her and spy on her because it was, exotic and alluring and titillating. And then the episode with the cardinal, again, there's a cardinal character that Guido is meeting with regularly, routinely, and the cardinal is giving him sort of spiritual advice. And so those episodes are based on Fellini's past as well. But it's all amplified. It's all, all of these experiences that come from his past are expanded on and in some ways, totally reinvented for the purpose of the film. Yes, Guido Anselmi is only experiencing what I also partly experienced in this movie. And the conclusion, if you can call it a conclusion, is this: we must never strain ourselves trying to understand, but try to feel with abandon. We must accept ourselves for what we are. This is what I am, and this is what I'm content to be. I want to stop building myths around myself. I want to see myself as I am, a liar, incoherent, hypocritical, cowardly. I want to have done with making problems out of life. I want to put myself in a position where I can love life, where I can love everything. I'm still talking about Guido, of course. And after all, St. Augustine said the same thing: love and do what you want. Well, he didn't put it like that exactly, but more or less. I myself am Italian. I was born there. I speak the language fluently. I just cannot help but sense the Italian in Fellini when he talks like this. This is a very Mediterranean Italian kind of worldview / attitude. So it just makes it so much easier for me to relate to this filmmaker. Okay. Last but not least, a way to frame your viewing experience of the film by knowing a little bit about some of Jung's most important theories. Two of those being his concept of individuation and the archetypes of the collective unconscious. I think that if you know a little something about these things, it makes 8.5 a much more interesting film and potentially more coherent, because it's a very challenging film, 8.5. Narratively, it's very disjointed. There are oftentimes, there are scenes whose, let's say, reality value is difficult to determine. Is this a fantasy, a vision? Is it something that's happening in the real world in real time? Is it a dream? The lines between these things are often blurred and not easy to parse out. So hopefully these concepts, in fact, enrich your experience and don't make it even more challenging. Fingers crossed. Okay, so Jung's conception of individuation was essentially the process of synthesizing the inherently competing, conflicting, or contradictory parts of human psychology, which even Freud acknowledged, right? There's an id and there's an ego. One is, these are both sides to our personality. One is trying to abide by social norms, fit into a larger society for the collective good. The other part, the id, is a kind of primitive, raging ball of desire and emotion that is tamed by the ego, but they're at odds, right? So this is the fact that there are parts of our psyche that are at odds. That's probably not anything new to you. But what Jung did with these conflicting parts is try to understand how to synthesize them by looking to cultures, myths, and art across the globe to figure out if there was some recipe or common thread for in fact synthesizing them. And he found that, at least in his mind, through what he called archetypes. I'll get to those in a second. Jung believed that the transition into midlife was when individuation, that process came to fruition. Partly because it takes a while for you to understand yourself well enough to know that there are these competing interests and competing sides to your personality, and have the critical distance to acknowledge that, they're not, one is not necessarily good, the other is not necessarily bad, that they need to be synthesized even though they've been in tension for the majority of your life. And that's not an easy thing to admit to yourself. So this is why many people think that 8.5 is sort of Fellini's, well, one way that Fellini begins to deal with his mortality. And it's easy to start thinking about your mortality once you reach your 40s. I mean, I'm almost there at 39, and I think about death much more than I did when I was in my 20s, as a lot of the 40-plus-year-olds out there will probably be able to attest to. So Jung went out into the world and found what he called archetypes. These are primordial images that have been accrued over the course of human evolution. They come from the shared experiences of human beings when we lived in very small tribes. And those experiences and memories of fundamental human behavior, things like sex and pair bonding and kinship structures and initiation rites and rituals. He saw commonalities in these across cultures, across time periods, across different geographical locations. He called these archetypes, these images archetypes, these recurring metaphors and symbols archetypes. And he thought that they spanned back in time to our very beginning as a species. And they're expressed, he thought, through dreams, fantasies, projections, art, and mythology, which is why the study of art and mythologies across time and across the world was so central to his research. Another way to think of archetypes is to think of them as memes, what Richard Dawkins calls memes, not the kinds of memes you find on the internet, but what Richard Dawkins, the biologist, calls a meme, which is like an individual unit of culture, an idea that takes hold in a culture and to spread across that culture and potentially across all mankind. So, a good example of a meme in Richard Dawkins' mind would be the concept of a monotheistic God, which starts in one place, right, but then spreads across the globe. Even if that manifestation of that monotheism is different, there's this central idea being conserved across cultures, across time. Okay, so that's what Jung meant by archetypes. The last thing I'll mention are some of the specific archetypes that Fellini is evoking, some of the Jungian archetypes Fellini is evoking in 8.5. Before you get there, though, here's a quote from Fellini about how our dreams are probably manifestations of very ancient fears, very ancient desires and motives. Just another taste of the Jungian inflection to Fellini's approach to 8.5 and cinema after his encounter with Jung's writings. So a couple of archetypes that Jung points out, there's a couple of Jungian archetypes that figure very prominently in 8.5. The persona versus the shadow. And these archetypes can be seen as like, these first two are a pair and the second two are a pair. The persona is the part of the self that you show publicly. It's the self that you identify most. It's the self that is the dutiful husband or wife, the loving son or daughter, the diligent factory worker or working professional. It's the self that you want, it's the self that you admire, that you pride, right? As opposed to the shadow, which is the part of ourselves we don't want to admit is there. These are the darker motivations, the more selfish ones, the spite in us, the unprovoked anger in us. And we tend to try to suppress the shadow. Again, this is in Freudian terms, the persona would be the ego and the shadow would be the id. But what Jung contributed to this binary is simply the research that leads him to believe that there are persona and shadow figures across cultures, across mythologies, represented through very different kinds of art forms, very different kinds of art. So you'll notice the first part of 8.5, or one way to think about the first part of 8.5 is Guido encountering more and more the shadow archetype, the shadow in him, being forced in some ways to acknowledge it, not doing so willingly even, but being forced by his dreams, for example. Another binary archetype in 8.5 is the anima versus the animus. The anima is simply the feminine side of the male personality, and the animus is the masculine side of the female personality. Freud believed there's a mixture of feminine and masculine in all of us. That's been borne out by science, I think, pretty rigorously. And that's why we have things like gender studies and a distinction between sex and gender, because all of us, men and women, we exhibit features, behaviors that are more classically feminine and more classically masculine. The anima figures very prominently in 8.5, Guido's anima. You will notice, I kind of don't want to spoil this for you, because you will encounter it very distinctly. All I'll say is this: when you encounter the phrase asa nisi masa, think anima, the feminine side of the male personality. To bring all of this Jungian stuff together, I'm going to appeal to an essay by Isabella Conti and William McCormick called Federico Fellini, Artist in Search of Self. Guido's problem is his need to reconcile opposites. Since these opposites exist in the environment he has created in response to an inner need, he cannot look to external circumstances to find a solution. He must find an answer within himself, since the source of the conflict lies within himself. So that is a beautiful little summary of one of the major themes of 8.5, the conflict within all of us, the tension between binaries that are inherent in human psychology and behavior that need to be synthesized. Sooner the better, but often that synthesis cannot take place until a certain amount of time and experience, a certain amount of time has passed and you've accrued a certain number of experience. There is a link between the symbol represented by the cardinal, the character of the cardinal, and the solution of the conflict related to the anima. The individuation process, writes Jung, is reserved for the middle of life, as it seems to be a preparation for death. Once this task is accomplished, death is no longer so frightening. It can be included in the totality of life. So, along with the archetypes that I've outlined briefly and these two little excerpts, I hope that you have at least enough to understand the Jungian context of the film, and enough to pick out these archetypes at least a few times throughout the film to see how they're operating. I don't expect that, that any of this will produce a master reading of the film that, that is airtight or anything like that. This is a movie that is designed to be interpreted and reinterpreted. And Fellini, when he talks about 8.5 and the meaning, he always talks in pretty broad terms. And he doesn't think there should be something like a master reading of the film, except unless that is a call to adventure, a call to personal adventure, a call to accepting yourself for who you are and all of your contradictions, and using that to inspire a more well-lived life, honestly. If that's going to be your master reading, I think Fellini can be on board. And I hope that's at the very least what you take away from it, if nothing else. So I will see you all again on Thursday, June 4th at 8 p.m., where we'll continue with a Q&A and maybe a couple more comments on the film. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm really excited for you to see the film, especially if you haven't seen it yet. I just want to say thanks for joining me, and thank you to the Coolidge Corner for continuing this amazing online virtual seminar series. I hope to be back for another one soon. Take care.